Something big sounds like it's just happened between the United States and India. According to Donald Trump, Washington and New Delhi have now struck a major trade deal, one that is going to slash tariffs, rewire India's entire energy policy, and supposedly end New Delhi's reliance on Russian oil. But there's a problem, unsurprisingly. Almost none of it is confirmed. Nothing has been signed, and the two leaders are describing entirely different agreements. So in this video, I want to break down what's actually just happened, what Trump has said has happened, what India has said has happened, what we still don't know, and why this so-called deal could be politically explosive inside India and strategically awkward for the United States. Let's dive in. This is The Global Gambit. How are you going, everyone? Welcome back. Here we look at the intersection of geopolitics, economics, and international relations, while engaging guests from historians to intelligence officers and former heads of state. Now, in this case, we're going to separate the headlines from the mechanics, what's been announced from what's actually been agreed, and political theatre from economic reality, something we do often here. It means a quick question, though, for all of you. What do you think of this? Does it actually mean a restore or a restoration of trust between Washington and New Delhi? Or just papers over deeper damage? Drop your comments below. You see, because this isn't just about tariffs, it's about leverage, trust, and how far the United States is willing to go in weaponizing trade again, and how far India is willing to push back. Now, to the announcement itself. On Monday, Donald Trump announced he'd reached a trade deal with Narendra Modi after a phone call between the two leaders. Trump claimed India had agreed to the following: stopping of buying Russian oil, buying far more American energy and goods, slashing tariffs on US products to 0. And in return, Trump has claimed the US will cut tariffs on Indian goods from 50%, one of the highest, to 18%. Now, markets have noticed, governments have reacted, and here I am making a video. But analysts immediately asked a simple question: is this actually a deal or just a declaration? Something that Trump likes to do. We can talk about his supposed peace deals, when often many of them are MOUs or Memorandum of Understandings, which simply mean they have no legal binding. They just sound good. And of course, Trump wastes no time in leveraging them to say that he is the unprecedented peacemaker and his lovely Board of Peace. But that's the politics. This is about the economics. You see, before getting into the substance, it's worth flagging a structural issue that will hang over everything else that I cover. What Washington has announced is not a conventional trade agreement in a legal sense. It's a Trump-era trade agreement, politically framed, flexible, and potentially reversible. That distinction matters because the US has not concluded a true bilateral or plurilateral free trade agreement in years. Enthusiasm, therefore, should be tempered. And so with that in mind, let's look at Trump's version more in depth. He wrote on Truth Social that Modi had agreed to stop buying Russian oil and instead buy energy from the US and potentially Venezuela. Trump claimed the US would reduce tariffs to this 18%, and India would eliminate all tariffs and non-tariff barriers on American goods. India more specifically would commit to buying over $500 billion worth of US energy, technology, agriculture, coal, and other things. White House officials later confirmed that punitive tariffs imposed last year over India's Russian oil purchases, a video that I made and you can go and find on the channel, would be dropped as part of this package. Now, from Trump's framing, this is a geopolitical win, a trade victory, and proof that pressure, of course, works. But that's where the story begins to unravel, because we have to look at the Indian or Modi's side and what they said. Narendra Modi shortly released his own statement, and the contrast was, unsurprisingly, striking. Modi did not mention a trade deal. He did not confirm stopping Russian oil imports. And he certainly did not commit to buying nearly $500 billion of US goods. He did not say India was eliminating tariffs either. Instead, he simply welcomed the reduction of US tariffs to 18% on Indian exports and praised Trump's leadership on global peace. That was it. No numbers, no commitments, no reciprocal concessions. And as some people I've spoken to have put it, it looks less like a deal and more like two political narratives flying mid-air. So the point of all of this is that Trump makes these grandiose claims, but when you look at the details of the opposing side, well, the reality hits hard. We've seen this with Trump and China. Trump claiming that a new reality of Chinese-American relations was entering the fray, and then the Chinese pouring some pretty cold or perhaps sub-zero temperature water on those claims. Now, if you're enjoying this kind of breakdown, less headline hype and more what's actually going on, then you'll love what I have coming up on the channel over the next few weeks. So stick around and perhaps consider subscribing. Okay, so let's talk numbers, but of course about that most eyebrow-raising claim of all, the 500 billion in US goods. Now, myself and others would emphasize it's wise to treat this figure as more aspirational than literal. To put it into perspective, right now, total US exports to India last year were about 41.5 billion. US service exports were roughly 41.8 billion. So what that implies is that Trump somehow is going to make this jump from 83 billion or so to 500 billion. That's not a marginal increase. It is a scale shift that would take years, if it ever happens at all. Ambition is not inherently bad, and US trade with India has undershot its potential for decades. But framing this as a sort of near-term commitment risks inflating expectations that neither side can realistically meet. It's also where relative advantage versus absolute gains gets confused. In international relations, there's an important distinction between the relative gains versus the absolute gains, or the relative losses versus the absolute losses. And in this case, the relative is very important here. If US tariffs are going to be a fact of life under Trump, and all evidence suggests that they will be, he uses them as a negotiating tool, after all, then what matters most for exporters is relative positioning. India landing at about 18% rather than 50% is a smooth landing. It also places India marginally below several other Southeastern Asian counterparts, including Vietnam and parts of ASEAN more broadly. Now, these are critical countries for offshoring and trade with the United States, and that helps at the margin. But tariffs are only one factor shaping investment and supply chain decisions. A 1 or 2% differential does not automatically outweigh deeper structural advantages elsewhere, say in logistics, scale, clustering, regulatory predictability, and integration into regional supply chains. There's a lot of debate around the world whether we're seeing an end to globalization in favor of more regionalization versus other people who argue that globalization in its purest form has never strictly existed because countries tend to always trade most of all with those that are closest to them, just simply for the physicality and transportation costs and such. You can find interesting talks I've had with Martin Wolf about that on the channel as well. You see, Vietnam's appeal, and China's before it, was never just about tariffs. It was about that ecosystem strength. Indeed, India's entire annual government budget is around 590 billion. So to claim that the United States is going to be having a 500 billion worth set of goods to India is a little bit optimistic. Trump is effectively claiming Modi agreed to purchase worth around 85% of India's total annual spending. And economists in India have been blunt, one describing the deal as disconcerting and another calling it just structurally unequal. So if the US keeps an 18% tariff whilst India drops its barriers to zero, that's not reciprocity, it's asymmetry. And of course, that matters politically. Then there is where the political risk for Modi becomes very acute. Agriculture is not just another sector in India, it is a red line. Nearly half of India's population depends on farming for their livelihood. Modi has already faced sustained nationwide farmer protests so large that they have forced his government in the past to reverse occasionally or reconsider their decisions. That context matters because the US is putting pressure on agriculture and it's long standing. Washington has repeatedly sought greater access for American agricultural products, including genetically modified crops, an issue that cuts straight across India's domestic politics very, very strongly. After the announcement, US officials openly celebrated expanded access to India's markets. Conversely, Indian officials have been pretty vague, and that if agriculture had been meaningfully opened, then it would contradict Modi's repeated promises that farmers would never be sacrificed in trade talks, especially with the United States. So if it has not, then Trump's description of the deal is baloney, overstated. But either way, the silence suggests unresolved tension rather than settled agreement. And so here comes the core problem within all of this. There is no published agreement. We simply don't know whether this is a formal trade agreement or a political framework, two very distinctive things. We don't know what happens to India's patent and intellectual property laws. We don't know whether US technology firms receive exemptions from India's planned digital taxes. And we don't know what labour or environmental standards are attached to any of this. How disputes will actually be resolved, and the contrast with India's recent agreement with the EU is also very instructive. That deal, negotiated over more than a decade, includes legal text, timelines, safeguards. This US announcement has none of that. which of course raises the deeper concern: precedent. The earlier decision by Washington to impose a 25% tariff penalty explicitly tied to India's Russian oil purchases broke a long-standing norm in that relationship. For years, both sides have worked hard to ensure that disagreements over third countries, Russia, Iran, China, Pakistan, for example, did not bleed into their core strategic partnership. Now, that firewall has been breached, and even if the penalty is going to be rolled back, the signal remains nonetheless. India remains a critical consideration for the United States' broader foreign policy, this counterbalancing against China. In international relations, there are critical aspects of push and pull factors. The United States trying for many years, decades, to pull into India onto its side, maybe not as a full-fledged ally, but as at least as a long-standing, reliable partner, such as, say, Saudi Arabia. However, with the events and recklessness of the United States administration, then China has been able to, well, demonstrate perhaps that it's not as bad, or the long-standing unique relationship that India has with Russia and their unwillingness to forego that because the West simply demands them do so because of Russia's war in Ukraine. India is a unique country in the way that it conducts its foreign policy. But in this case, the Trump administration doesn't seem to have got that memo. Now, the government in India has hailed the announcement as historic, and senior ministers have promised job creation, export growth, and protection for all the sensitive sectors. But they haven't explained how. The opposition, meanwhile, has gone on the offensive. Rahul Gandhi has accused Modi of selling the country under pressure from Washington. Farmer groups are watching closely, and a lot of markets are feeling nervous. And the longer the details are delayed, the louder the criticisms will become. But ultimately, it's more about what the United States has overpromised than what India has underpromised. So let's be precise with what this actually represents. The announcement stabilizes a relationship that was sliding towards outright dysfunction. It removes absurd tariff penalty, restores a basic flaw under US-Indian ties, and gives both leaders political breathing room. That is not nothing, but it is not a reset, and it is certainly not a restoration of trust, which shouldn't have been eradicated in the first place. Most of the heavy lifting has already been done earlier in this video. We've seen why the deal is thin, why the numbers are aspirational, why agriculture and that Russian oil remain unresolved, and why tariffs under Trump are instruments of leverage rather than settled policy. What remains, therefore, is the aftertaste. For over 2 decades, the quiet success of US-Indian relations was depoliticalization. Painful agreements over Russia, Iran, Pakistan were deliberately quarantined so that they didn't poison the broader core partnership. The decision to weaponize tariffs over India's oil choices has shattered that norm and demonstrates again the short-term thinking of the Trump administration over the longer-term strategical value. Officials who have helped pull this relationship back from the brink do deserve credit, but the ceiling of this trust is now lower than it ever was before and never really needed to be. So this is effectively a pause, and what happens next, or how quietly things are implemented, how often the terms are reopened, and whether any third country disputes are kept out of that relationship will matter far more than what was simply announced. Well, that's it for me. If you found this breakdown useful, then be sure that you're subscribed and give the video a like. It's simple, but it really helps, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. If you don't know me, my name's Pyotr. I am half Russian, half British, and I try to bring that global perspective to things, not purely reiterating a Western narrative, but also a more balanced, nuanced approach, including how I engage my guests. But thanks a lot. See you next time.